All right, good evening, gentlemen. Good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and open up. We're in chapter 23 of the book of Acts, but I think that part goes without being said. So last week, that means we wrapped up chapter 22. That's usually how it works. But we've got our maps here, so as we continue to go through that, the review time, let's go through our maps. Remember that we are finished up now on Paul's third missionary journey. So here's the first journey and what that looked like. So hopefully it's sparking your memory. You're starting to remember things that we've talked about the last several months. And so Paul on this first trip goes off with who on this first trip? Who journeys with him on the first mission journey? Barnabas, good. Paul and Barnabas set sail from Antioch, which we refer to as home base. That, remember, is the first Gentile church. Essentially, when the gospel started being spread from persecution, which ironically Paul was, the primary instrument in that persecution. So he and Barnabas are pastoring the church at Antioch. They then go on a mission trip. That first journey is about a year. The main part they hit, remember, was Galatia, with instrumental stops at Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. Remember what happened in Lystra on that first journey that was significant? Anybody recall what happened to Paul in Lystra?
Got stoned. That where he got stoned?
Good. Yep. Got stoned to death, but he gets up and goes back into the city, right? So that's an awesome part there. We get back to Antioch. They report, and then there's a little break there, but then they set back out. Several months later, on their second journey, they go back through. Remember, his intent was to go back through the churches they had already planted, and wanted to encourage them and check on them and see how they were doing. And then they make it to Lystra here again, and another significant thing happens at Lystra on the second journey, and what would that be? He picks up a friend, meets somebody. Who would that young man be? Timothy, right? Okay, so we meet Timothy. He picks him up, and Timothy's obviously going to be instrumental and be with him for the rest of his life and be, a son to him, and Paul starts that mentoring process, discipling process with him there. They journey up into Troas up here, where remember Luke joins the party. And we see that on and off as we see it go from first person, third person to first person, and the they and them turns to we's and us. So we know that Luke is in there with them. And that's that. We're getting about chapter 16, 17, 18. Remember, chapter 13 and 14 is the first journey. Chapter 15 is what? That's a big chapter. Remember, what's the significance and importance of that?
Is that the council?
Yeah, good. So chapter 15 is the council at Jerusalem. Then chapter 16, 17, 18 is the second journey. And so chapter 16, we get up into Philippi. Remember up in Macedonia up here. You got Philippi, you got Thessalonica, you got Berea. And then in chapter 17, he gets down to Greece where he goes to Athens. Then in chapter 18, we're in Corinth. And he spends, remember, a good deal of time there, 18 months there. And then he journeys his way to go back to Jerusalem to report. And they stop by real quickly for a brief stop at Ephesus, where they ask him to stay, and he says, no, but I will come back if the Lord wills, which we know he does, because the next journey he's going to go and spend 3 years on that journey. So let's look at what that one looks like. So this second journey is about 4 years. Third journey is also going to be about 4 years, but he primarily spends, like I said, 3/4 of that in Ephesus. So a great bit of time there. Remember, he's writing, not only is he going back to these churches that he's planted, he's also writing letters back to them to encourage them and to help them along the way as well. So remember, at the end of the first journey, he had going back to that. The first journey is Galatia. When he gets back, he then sends letters to Galatia, and that's obviously the book of Galatians there. Then on the second trip he writes 2 books, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay, so on that second trip, probably from Corinth, I believe, he writes back to Thessalonica. And then on the third trip, we have 3 books that he writes, which is what? Anybody remember what are 3 books we write on that get written on the third trip?
1st and 2nd Thessalonians.
That was the second trip. It is the 1st and 2nd.
Corinthians?
Oh, good. So 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And then, what's the other one?
Colossians.
Nope.
Ephesians.
Sunday school. Romans. Good.
That's
So
right.
he stops here in Ephesus for 3 years and writes letters to first and second letters to Corinthians at that time, and then as he goes by on the journey, he gets into Corinth, and that's where he writes the letter to the Romans over to Rome. Okay, so I know that's a lot of stuff. We've said it a couple times. So I just want to keep you fresh on that. It's going to be instrumental too when we go into our next study. Remember, we're going to go into church history, and so we're going to be beating that up a little bit more too. So it's all good for us. So about like I said, about 4 years this one takes. Remember, a significant thing is on the way back, they stop in Miletus, and the elders from the Ephesian church come, and that's where they have the very heartfelt, farewell, because Paul tells them, you're not going to see me any longer. He knows that what lies ahead when he goes to Jerusalem, the Spirit has told him, remember, in every city that there will be afflictions awaiting him to get there. Remember, they all try to discourage him, tell him not to go, but he says, this is God's will, and that's what I'm going to do. So he gets to Tyre, we get down to Caesarea, where he stays with Philip. Remember, one of the 7 deacons from chapter 6. Then we got into chapter 21, where he gets to Jerusalem. And that was, remember, he was racing from Philippi to get there for the Festival of Pentecost, if you guys recall that, okay? That's why he didn't want to stop too long in Ephesus on the way, because they wanted to make it back for Pentecost. Now he gets there, and he's met with hostility like usual, but especially in Jerusalem, you have the bigwigs, right? The high priest, the chief priests, all the guys who are there that hate Paul now because he's switched teams. And so, he's met with hostility there. They accuse him of bringing, remember, Trophimus, a Gentile, into the temple. And so they take him out to stone him. And remember, the commander of the Roman battalion there comes and intervenes and takes him. And they drag him up the stairs. And as he is taken up the stairs, he is allowed to speak to all the Jews who are there, yelling and screaming. And remember, the commander gives him an opportunity to speak. And Paul again uses this platform to preach the gospel to the Jews. And so they listen for a moment to hear part of his testimony, but once he switches to the way, right, talking about this way that I persecuted, meaning Jesus, they said, away with him, let's kill him again, we hate him again, let's kill this guy. And so now the commander is being pretty much an instrument of God, right, a tool to protect Paul. And so he has now been taken back into the barracks. And last week we finished up in chapter 22 seeing that speech, or that sermon really, that he gave. And then remember, he still wants to find out the truth, the commander. And we're going to find out his name is Lysias, okay, or Lysias. So this commander, he wants to know the truth, because remember, he's on the hook for that too as well, with the governors and Caesar and all that. It's important, that he keeps a tidy ship, and keeps things in order. And there can't be riots and mobs and all this stuff happening, or it reflects badly on the leadership there, and the Romans will come down upon them and they'll get in trouble. So they don't want to do that. But also on the other side of that coin, the Jews use that card for their benefit and say, well, you don't want this happening on your watch. You want to be a friend to Caesar, right? And all the same things that they kind of got Pilate with in the whole crucifixion of Jesus. Same thing. So we saw at the end of chapter 22 that he wanted to still know the truth of what was happening. So they brought Paul in. Remember, they were going to flog him. And then they find out that Paul is a Roman citizen. And that changed the whole ball game, because now the commander is not only, he's fearful, we should say he's fearful now, because now he's realizing he's mistreated a Roman citizen, and what he was about to do to a Roman citizen would have had severe consequences on him, okay, with this flogging. So Paul's being saved now from the flogging because of his Roman citizenship. And it says now, last verse, verse 30 of chapter 22, it says, the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. So now as we transition into to chapter 23, we are going to see Paul's defense before the council. Remember, that council we're talking about is the Sanhedrin. It's the gathering of the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, on and on and on with these groups of the religious leaders that would have been there. Remember, I showed you at the end of last week that Paul, in fact, was a part of them, and we're going to see in the next couple of chapters. He used to be part of that council, okay? He was on the Sanhedrin and used to cast his vote, we'll find out, against people, just like they're trying him on the same basis now. So it's very interesting to see that happening. So that's where we are as we start in chapter 23 tonight. So let's get to it, verse 1. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. That's awesome. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Verse 6. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council and said, Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if an angel or a spirit spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune or the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn into pieces by them, and he commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood by him and said, Take courage, for as you have testified the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, Paul, the prisoner, has called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand and went aside and asked him privately, What is it that you have to tell me? And he said, The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, and as they were going to inquire somewhat of him more closely. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, Tell no one what you have informed me of. Verse 23. Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter to this effect. Verse 26. Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor Felix, greetings. And there you go in verse 26. There's our commander's name. See it? Claudius Lysias. So now we have a name. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. And when I came upon him with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen, and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but being charged with nothing deserving death nor imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. Verse 31. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they came to Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor, and they presented Paul before him. On the reading of the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Let's pray. Lord, we love you. We thank you for the text. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your spirit and the work that you do through your word in our lives, God. We just ask that you would teach us again and just continue to reveal yourself to us in a greater way tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Always lots of good stuff. My brain just goes so far forward, I gotta reel it back. It's like, man, okay. Back to verse 1. So Paul now is addressing this council because remember he's already kind of given a defense. Remember on the staircase there outside where he's been beaten, he's given his defense or his words and his testimony and really preached a sermon, right, to the Jews outside that want to kill him. And so now he's given the opportunity to speak to the council. And so he's taken before them because remember, Lysias, this commander, wants to find out the truth of what's happening here. So he says, Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God. and he calls them brethren. I think that's significant to me, because sometimes in some of the other letters we've seen that he's written epistles where we've seen brethren to mean what? Believers. To the brethren at Corinth, or something to that degree. This is obviously talking to Jews, not Christians. So he's talking about his nationality, his Jewish brethren. Okay, and also that he is not referring to them and he's sitting there on trial saying your honor, or to the elders or the chief priests and the rulers. He's not giving. Oh, no, we don't want to update right now. Hold on. No, thank you. We've had that happen before. So, and then boom, all your notes are gone. But he is not giving them that sense. He's kind of talking to them on an equal footing. See that? He was a member of this council. Remember, he says later, I'm a Jew of Jews, I'm under Gamaliel, all that stuff that we know about Paul. There is none greater in that sense than him, and obviously he has been changed now and he's a believer now. He's not speaking up to them and giving them that kind of honor or authority, but he's just speaking to them, like a typical person would to their peers. So he also says here something too, that I don't want to mislead or any of us be misled on. It says, I live my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. So not meaning that he followed the law perfectly, because we know that's impossible and that nobody can do that. And Paul himself says that over and over and over in the New Testament, especially in Romans. We're going to beat up with that right now in chapter 7. So he's just saying that the intent, think about the conscience, and especially in Romans, as we've come through that, half of you guys in Sunday school with me, Romans chapter 1 and 2, is about that, and it talks about how all men have a conscience within them, and how God has written, part of his law on their hearts. Now, it's not a saving conscience and a saving understanding of Jesus Christ, but there is a conscience in every single one of us. But we know Romans 2 is clear about what happens with that conscience if it's not led by, and your heart's not changed by, and your will's not changed by God to follow Christ in that. Your conscience is going to go the wrong way, okay? Because there are none good, no, not one, right? No one seeks God, Romans 3. Okay, so he's saying that he responded to his conscience when God had him respond to it, right? And that's what we all did. When God opened your heart and opened your ears to hear the truth of the gospel and understand that, then you have changed, and now you've responded to that conscience that was put in you in the first place. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. High priest Ananias, verse 2, commanded those near him to strike him in the mouth. Man, this guy, not playing around. They're so over Paul already, obviously, and he just says, hey man, somebody stop that fool from talking right now. And the problem with this is, it's just like in the Matthew study, if you remember, this is just coming to my mind now. But remember, actually, the high priest tore his clothes. Anybody? What was the name of the high priest at that time when Jesus was in his trial and those things? Anybody remember? Caiaphas. Good. There was also another one, Annas, but Caiaphas was the one in charge at that time. And so remember, and that gives me a good point to bring up our timeline. We're in about 57 A.D., where we are right now. Remember, getting into Jerusalem in chapter 21, I said we're about 57 A.D. So we're about 57, 58 A.D. So we're at about, if Christ died around, say, 28 to 30, let's call it 28, we're about 30 years after. Okay, that's where we're at in the timeline. We're about 30 years after the ascension of Christ, and this is happening. And Paul was saved in about 34, we said, BC. So this is about 20-something years after his conversion. And so now we see, my point of all that was to say that, remember, Caiaphas ripped his garments and tore his garments when Jesus said something. And I took you back to the law to show you how that actually disqualified him from being the high priest. That he actually disqualified himself, right there in front of Jesus. And this guy didn't disqualify himself, but this was against the law. And it was against what the Talmud. Anybody heard of the Talmud? So that is essentially a Jewish book of laws. It's not inspired, it's not scripture, but it is a book of rules that they would follow, that all Jews would, all religious traditional Jews would follow the laws and rules in there, saying that they were part of the law that was intended by God. And so one of the laws and one of the rules in the Talmud says, he who strikes one Israelite strikes as if it were the glory of God. So it's saying not to strike your brothers and not to do those things. So they obviously have no problem disregarding their own, and we've seen that over and over and over. They had no problem disregarding their own law for their own benefits and for what they want to do. Okay, but yet then they'll come back on you and say, oh, well, you're not doing that, and that's where Paul's about to call this guy out actually right now. And I wanted to note too that from Josephus, historian back in early church history, it was recorded that this Ananias was definitely known to be not a good high priest and not a good guy. He was stealing the tithes that the people would bring. He was known for greed. He was known for all these things. So it shouldn't be too shocking that we know a lot of these guys were like that. A lot of those were in authority, tax collectors, skimming on the side. All that stuff is all humanity. It's never changed. It's still the same today. It's still the same back then. But this guy was known not to have a good reputation, is the point.
He was also assassinated by people years later.
Yeah, that's right. Because they turned on him. And we're going to see many of those stories later, for sure.
Who was that?
This guy, Ananias, this high priest. So Paul, being Paul, and always being ever so bold, says to him, God's going to strike you, you whitewash wall. And what does that bring to mind? You guys have got to be recalling the same thing that
Matthew.
Good. What was it? What
Just
happened?
saying that, from the outside you look, it's like inside you like dead tombs or something
Whitewashed
like that.
tombs.
Yeah.
That's right. Good. So Jesus said that, right? About who? About those groups, about the Pharisees, okay, and the Sadducees. That's right. That you're the whitewashed tombs or sepulchres. That exactly right. What Sam said. You do all these things for presentation. You pray the loud prayers. You sit it up in the best seats in the synagogues and the temple. And you do all this stuff, but inside, you're rotten dead men's bones. Okay, so you're not fooling anybody here. But that's exactly what Paul is saying to them here as well. And now he does call him out, like we just talked about, for being a hypocrite, because he says to him, he says, "You're going to judge me." That you're going to judge me by the law, that you're going to be struck. Where is it? God is going to strike you, you whitewash wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? So he's like, you just broke the law by the order that you just gave, you hypocrite. You know what I mean? Like, what are you doing? And so, with the reputation that this guy seems to have, I'm sure it wasn't the first time he was being called out for this. But yeah, Paul is definitely going to hold him accountable to what he's doing. But I want us to also recognize in this that these people come right back at him and say, are you speaking against God's high priest? Do you revile God's high priest? And so Paul kind of, nips that in the butt immediately, and he needs to, because when you go back to Exodus 22 here, I'm going to flip back real quick because we've got time, so if you want to flip back to...
Revile God, nor curse the ruler of your people.
One more time, louder.
You shall not revile God, nor curse the ruler of your people.
There you go. Should not revile God or curse a ruler of your people. Well, the highest ruler of the people there would be the high priest. So you would not be able to speak against him in certain ways, especially like that, publicly degrading him and doing those kinds of things, and it could be punishable by death. So Paul recognizes his wrong in doing that, and so he immediately excuses himself by saying, look what he said. Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Obviously, Paul, knowing the law, quotes from the law there to say, hey, I understand what I just did and what the law says. I'm telling you this is why I did it. I didn't know better. I didn't know. And there's a couple of things we can talk about now why that may be, because remember, we talked about this a little bit before, but we'll get into a bigger timeline later as we get into church history and stuff. But that remember after his conversion, okay? So conversion was about 34. Then he went for 3 years, remember, in Arabia. We had that gap there, and we've talked about that in Galatians 1. He talks about it. So for 3 years, there's a gap. Then he goes to Jerusalem. Then he goes back to Tarsus, where he's from, and he lived there for a while. And then until... in our map, remember Antioch. Barnabas is being a pastor here at Antioch. Barnabas goes back up to Tarsus and gets Paul and brings him back to be with him in Antioch. And then that's when they go on the first trip. So my point being, that's about 38 BC. AD. So the time we're at now is about 57. So about 20 years that he is in Tarsus, that he's on the 3 mission journeys. So my point of it being that he hasn't been in Jerusalem. Understand? Only a couple brief visits that we've seen where he's updated the council, like in chapter 15, after a couple of those trips where he's briefly done that. So he could be not aware of who the high priest is. You understand what we're saying? Also, you can look at it in the sense of the way the text is written. I looked at a few different translations and took it back to kind of look at, compare it against obviously the original to see what that means. But it could also imply that he didn't know who said the order. See, they're in a big group, and somebody said, hey, hit that guy in the mouth. And so it could be that he's saying, I didn't know it was the high priest that gave that order. See what I'm saying? So that is a possible interpretation as well. Another interpretation would also be about, if you'll flip, go ahead and flip to Galatians 4 while we're talking about this. But another possibility could be that he had a ailment, which was failing eyesight. And so some people think that this is a thought which later on we'll see that he had these things and a thorn in the flesh. I know we've talked about that sometimes. What could that have been? It could have been physical ailments. This one we know he had, because look at chapter 4 of Galatians. And remember, he wrote the book of Galatians after that first trip. So this is after that point. Are you with me? So I'm trying to get us to a problem here, that it could have been that his eyesight isn't that good, because if you go to chapter 4, look at verse 14, and this is the closing, getting to in Galatians here shortly. It says, if I can find it, and though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your own eyes and given them to me. Now go over to chapter 6 real quick and look at verse 11, same Galatians. It says, see with what large letters I am writing to you in my own hand. Okay, so there's implications here that something's going on with Paul's eyes. Either he was injured or had an infection. Something was happening, because he's referring to it in Galatians to them saying, you would have given me your own eyes so that I could have seen if you could have. And saying, see the large handwriting because I'm writing this in my own. He's giving us some examples there, and he gives some insight there that something was happening on this journey when he was there. And so another possibility. Okay, so those are just a couple possibilities I wanted to give to you to understand, because the question arises obviously when you read that, like, how would he not know he's the high priest? You know what I mean? I mean, he's the high priest. Everybody knows him. But those things are all plausible, especially the first one I brought up, which is the first one I thought of was he hasn't been there. You know what I mean? He's been gone for 20 years.
Are they dressed different though? I mean, they would have had different.
Yeah, but there's a big mob and a big, the council there. Not a big mob, but the council's there. And again, like I said, if it could be his eyesight or it could be, whatever. They're all in a group like this, and somebody shouts something, you don't really know who said it. You know what I mean? It's not like a group here where, if I close my eyes and one of you said something, I know who it is because we talk all the time. He hadn't been there in 20 years. He don't talk to these guys and really know them, except for when he knows of them.
How old was Paul at this time?
Well, it's like 57 AD. He's more like 5. So he's like 52. He's like early 50s to mid 50s. Okay, so, and he's going to die soon, like 66. So we're in like the last 8-10 years. Okay, so yeah, that's the time frame. That's the age. That's good context. That's what we're talking about. So now, the hand grenade. This is good stuff, man. So now Paul just throws a big hand grenade in the middle of the room, right? But perceiving. So, through his own wisdom and obviously through the Holy Spirit, Paul perceives, knowing this group and knowing the Sanhedrin, that some of them are Pharisees and some of them are Sadducees. So Paul cries out to the council, hey guys, look, the problem here, why I'm being put on trial right now, is because of the hope that I have in the resurrection of the dead. And I mean, just mic drop. Just drop the mic and back up, because now he knows, dude, I mean, it's like you're in Sharkville and you just threw the chum in there. It's like frenzy. You know what I mean? It's like these guys are going to go at each other right now like crazy. So it's going to be like picking a fight in basketball or football, or, Cowboys, Redskins fans, Ohio State, Michigan, whatever it is. It's just not going to be good when you drop that in there. There's going to be a lot of banter and a lot of arguments going on back and forth. And we see that's exactly what happened, because it says when he did this, a dissension happened between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the council was divided. Well, guess what? Now they're divided. They're not going to be really effective against Paul in this moment, are they? And we've seen that throughout, since the Gospels with Christ, that these guys, the Herodians, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. Look, there were the Pharisees had their own scribes, and the Sadducees had their own scribes, and there was division upon division upon division of all the leaders, and they had their own little sects and their own little groups, and they didn't like the other ones because they didn't believe exactly what they believed, and they didn't like each other. So when you see them coming together, and I pointed this out a lot in the Matthew study, when you see them coming together for the common cause, that's how much they all hate this guy. That's how much they all hate Jesus, and that's how much they all hate Paul, and they all hate the apostles and all the things that in this sect or this cult that they call the Way. That's where we see hatred, in its purest, because it'll bring enemies together to go against a common bigger enemy, as they see a threat to their livelihood. So that's what's happening here, and now Paul is diffusing that. With just using the wits and the understanding that he knows about this group. So the disagreement occurs here because we read it right here in the text here, and this is the proof text, obviously, for how we know the difference, as we talked about Pharisees and Sadducees. So there would have been several differences in beliefs, but this was a big one, right? That Pharisees believe in a spirit and an afterlife and a resurrection of the dead, of the righteous and the wicked. Sadducees don't believe in any of that. They don't think you have a spirit or a soul or an afterlife. They don't believe in a bodily resurrection of the dead. They don't believe any of that. So they're at two polar ends of the spectrum on this thing. There's no coming to agreements here on what they're talking about. And so that's why Paul brings this up and starts it out with what? Hey, I'm a Pharisee, and my daddy was a Pharisee, and his daddy's daddy was a Pharisee. I'm a son of Pharisees. This is who I am through and through, and that's why they're picking on me. Because you Pharisees know that me as a Pharisee, I believe in the resurrection. Now all the Sadducees are just going crazy, like, oh, he's one of them. You know what I mean? You can just see the scene that's happening there, and they're just going to start to lose their wits and lose their way.
But they all,
Yeah,
but they're all
certainly
Jews.
Yes.
So they didn't believe like Abraham or anybody was like he just died and that was it.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly what they believe. Kind of like annihilation is really what it is. It's annihilation view, that, and a lot of non-believers believe that, you know what I mean? And some believers believe that wrongly, but that people will believe, hey, when you die, it's just over. The lights turn out and you're done. It's that's annihilation view. There's just nothing after this at all. So yeah, people would believe that.
Wait, believers believe that too? How does that work?
Wrongly.
It doesn't. That's exactly right.
So-called believers.
That's exactly right. But you'd be surprised. I mean, we know believers believe a lot of different things, and they can truly still be believers. They can just be wrong, and they can be immature, and they could have been taught wrong and led wrong, and hopefully they'll be led right. They'll be corrected and reproved for that, and that's what the scriptures are for. So, and it's clear. I think I actually have I might not have put it in here. I know it was in my studying and my thoughts. So it actually, Jesus goes at them for it when he was on the scene. So when we go back to the Gospels and we see in Matthew, remember, it was some of the Sadducees that came at him. The lawyers, the scribes, they all came at him. And then it said that the Sadducees came on their turn, and they said, remember the crazy story they gave him about, well, there was a man that was married, and he died, and so the wife went to his brother, and there were 7 brothers, and they all died, and they all had her, and she was the wife, but none of them had children, and so in the resurrection, then who would she be married to? You know what I mean? Like, oh, what are you going to say about that? You know what I mean? Because they're thinking because there is no resurrection. Well, Jesus' answer is stated emphatically, and he says, you do err. He said clearly, you think wrong about the scriptures and about the power of God. There is a resurrection of the body of the living and the dead. And that's what he says. So clearly we know there is a resurrection, and we know through the Bible there's 2 of them. And so there'll be one for the just and the unjust. But anyways, that's the point, is their different view on that is a perfect place for Paul to just jump in here and kind of cause waves and make a way out.
And it works, and like the Pharisees automatically, well, we don't think there's anything wrong with it.
That's what I mean. So now the Pharisees are on Paul's side. Paul just went like, oh, I got these guys now. They may be against me, but look, they're not all against me now. now I've got some on my side, and they're going to take some of the heat and take some of the.
It's like
pounding.
just to get at the Sadducees, they say that. It's almost, you know.
Yep, totally. Because Sadducees are just
Well, you know what? We also don't think that these
right. Yeah, I mean it's just uproar of all happening, and so and you know it was getting nasty too because look at what it says. Look at what Lysias says. It says that the commander feared Paul would be torn to pieces by them. You know what I mean?
So there's violence.
Yeah, they're getting nuts
Which
on
one
him.
was Ananias?
Huh?
Which was Ananias?
It's a good call. I don't know. I don't know. I don't have notes and didn't look into that. I don't know that we know that which side he would have been on, but it's a great question. Don't know if anybody's got study notes in there, but yeah, don't know.
Being that he would end up being, I mean, it's just speculation, being a crooked high priest, there's a good chance he was on the Sadducee side that didn't believe in so many other things.
You never know. You never know. We are faulty. They definitely had many different beliefs and many false beliefs, as Jesus pointed out to them in that one. So, either way, we know that it has caused a big ruckus and violence, like Sam said, because just like we saw in chapter 22, I think that was actually, and then in 21, you know, where they carried him up the stairs. It said they had to help Paul up the stairs because of the violence of the crowd. You know, they were beating the tar out of him. And remember dragging him outside the city because they were going to kill him and stone him because they were accusing him, remember, of bringing a Gentile too far in the temple, which was defiling it. So, but remember, that was an accusation we'll get into later because we're going to see that next chapter, next couple weeks. Okay, so the commander orders that Paul be brought back into the barracks. And it's just, again, an awesome picture because we're going to see, I mean, I hope you guys are seeing the bigger story here. Going back to how we always get back to God's sovereign will. And bondage of your will, and you know there's no freedom of the will, it's bondage of the will. You were a slave to sin and Satan, and now you're a slave to Christ and righteousness, and all that stuff. God doesn't care. God's sovereign will trumps your free will every single time. If you want to think you have a free will and makes you sleep better at night, go ahead, but God's sovereign will is gonna take hold, and it's gonna happen. And he told Paul, remember, that he would go to Jerusalem. Now he's telling Paul we're about to get there, but he's going to tell Paul, not only are you going to do that here, you're going to be okay because you're still going to Rome too. Which means what? He's not going to die here in Jerusalem. It means he's going to be protected by God. So that until he wants to protect him and wants to finish his story, which will be in Rome. And he chooses not to protect him in Rome anymore. Just like we saw, look at chapter 12, James got killed, right? But Peter got released. Remember that? Okay, so God's will, thy will be done. Even as Jesus said, not mine, thine. So that's what we're doing, that's what we're seeing. And it says that night, the Lord stood by his side. And what an awesome thing that is, you know? So here's Paul, and that night, boom, Jesus is standing beside you, talking to you, comforting you. That's pretty awesome. Okay, take courage. As you have been a witness here for me in Jerusalem, you will also be, and it says you must, right? Sovereign will of God again. You must, because why? Because I've already ordained work for you to do there. Before you even knew that I was going to knock you off the horse and save your butt, before the foundation of the world, before I even created it, I already had this for you to do, to go to Rome to do this. You're going to be just fine. Don't worry about it.
But he slept good that night.
No,
Right?
there's another fight.
I bet the night before wasn't so good. That's right, man. So take
Same
courage.
story, almost every town, though.
That's right. Take courage. You must do this. And we've seen this with, that was to jog my memory, it was chapter 18, on that second journey with Corinth. Because remember, he was there for a long time. And remember, the crowd drug him out to be, before the Bema seat, to be judged on these same kind of charges by the Jews. And remember what happened? They ended up, Jesus told them in a dream that night and said, don't worry about it. Be bold and do what you're doing. I have many people in this town, and no harm will come to you. Remember that? And the next day, the riot starts, and things look bad, and what happens? They set Paul aside, and they go and grab, I think Sosthenes was his name, but they grabbed one of the other Jews and beat him up instead. And Paul was just fine. So Paul knows, obviously, that God is true and Jesus is true to his word, but we've seen that, obviously, in time and time again through Acts already. So going back again here to God's sovereign rule and God's sovereign plan, recognize here too, guys, that Paul, with this preaching on the stairs, with now preaching directly to the council, he doesn't have a receptive audience here, right? Are you with me? There's no conversions really happening at this point. It's not like these Jews are coming and they're believing. We see the opposite. They're wanting to kill him, and they're all after him. So looking at that, I see that Paul's not responsible for the reaction of the people that he preaches to. And you know that I see that everywhere, because I talk to you about that all the time, especially to other pastors, that it's encouragement to me, when I learned that years ago, that it's not on you. Look, it's not my job to save anyone. That's way above my pay grade. It's my job to preach it. That's what Paul did. Paul did the work that was ordained and set before him. That's what you do. That's what you do. That's what I do. You tell your neighbor. You witness to your sister. It's on and on and on with those things and the opportunities. Brian speak at the ICS graduation. On and on with those things. You give the word and you do that. You can't save no one. You can't change their heart and make them understand and receive what it is you're preaching. Only the Holy Spirit can do that. So his responsibility, and remember what he said? He said this before to the Jews. Remember what he said with, I'm shaking the dust off. He shakes out his clothes, and the dust is off me. And we went to Ezekiel 33 about the watchman. Remember that? I've told you, I've done my due diligence. Your blood be on your own heads. It's not on me. I've done my part. If God doesn't save you in that, that's God's sovereign will. It's not my problem. And that's not to have the mind frame of being, oh, whatever, it's no big deal. I mean, we want to be feeling for people. We want to be praying that God does a work, that the Holy Spirit changes your heart, changes your life, and that my preaching, your coming alongside, that somehow in that, God does a work in them and changes their heart so that they're saved. So that's the intent of what we want to be doing. But understand that the accountability is not on me for how many people are saved from my preaching and from my life. Understand? There's a difference there. Okay, so that's God's work. And so in this, we don't see that Paul is he broken for his brethren? Does he want them to be saved? He does. You read the rest of the New Testament, his letters, you see Paul's heart and his humility and how he wants people to be saved. That's no doubt, and people should see that in our lives. So you couldn't come to me and say, oh, you don't care about that. That's nonsense. You don't know me then. We know Paul. We know who he is. We know he wants these brethren, these Jewish men to be saved. But on the other side of that coin, also, it's not his duty to do it. He's done his due diligence, and God has essentially given him the thumbs up of, hey, job well done. You're done here. I'm taking you to Rome. Your tour's up. You've done a good job. Let's move on to the next thing that I've got for you. Okay? There's still more work for you to do. That's what he's really saying, right? He's saying, look, you're done here. It's fine. And he told them at the beginning. Remember, he said, I took you out quickly because I knew that they would not listen to your witness of me in Jerusalem. And that's why he didn't stay. He took Paul out to the Gentiles and out on the journeys and on the trips. They're not going to receive me here, but now you're here. Give them the word and give them the news again, and we're out of here. There's more to do. So let's keep going. Okay.
And he created a little bit of a doubt in some of the Pharisees. Says there, some of them said, we don't find anything wrong.
Exactly, because now they're like on his side, right? They're like, hey, this guy's one of us, and so they kind of felt like they had to stick up for him a little bit. Well, he hasn't done anything wrong. That's exactly right.
It says only some of them. But...
Well, which ones would those be? Which would the some be?
Well, it said the
Scribes,
teachers of the
the
law.
Pharisees,
Yeah.
Right.
Scribes.
Right, of the Pharisees. Right, they'd be of the Pharisaical sect because they believe, obviously, in the resurrection, as he just stated he did. And so those would be the ones, obviously, being on his side.
Maybe he was spoken to by an angel.
That's right. Yeah, they're saying even maybe a spirit or an angel came and told him these things, So they believe that would be happening.
Well, it shows you how big of a point that was for them.
Yeah.
And that's why it was created so much
division, right.
Because, I mean,
They believe so much
they're
in
all up in
prophets.
arms, they hate Paul, whatever, but that was enough to turn them. I mean,
Right.
it must have been a pretty powerful point, because they obviously didn't seem like they were going to be turned easily.
And Paul knew what a powerful point it was.
He knew all the buttons to push, for sure.
Brian, did you have something there?
Well, I was just connecting a couple dots on those relationship between the different factions, and the fact that we talk about the chief priests in verse 14 coming up, which the chief priests were included former high priest, and so I think MacArthur was making a connection that would lead me to think that Ananias would be a Sadducee.
Right. And I've heard that most of the high priests
were Sadducees. So back to Jeff, your question, I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, it's probable. Yeah, I would say it's definitely probable. Good. Good. All right. Well, again, we know that Paul knows, as Jesus told him, that when you go to Jerusalem, affliction and persecution await you. That's not a new thing to Paul, right? He's seen this movie before. I mean, this is what's been happening. He's been beaten. He's been, when we go to, 1 Corinthians 12, and see the laundry list, remember, of all the things that happened when he got beaten, how many times, and all that stuff. He got stoned in Lystra and left for dead, and all the things that happened. You know that when he says to him, you must testify also in Rome, he knew it was still going to be that lifestyle. It wasn't going to be. The funny thing is how he chose to do it, and that's where I was getting to a little earlier, that you see God's hand upon everything like we should. That not only does he protect him, but as we're going to get to here, he takes and he chooses how he's going to do this on the Roman government's coin, and how he's going to provide ways and means to do that. But anyways, I get ahead of myself. Let's go back. God bless you. Let's go back to verse 13. Well, that's a good point too, though. That's why I keep my notes there in front of us. Also knowing God will protect him while he accomplishes this work. That's a big deal. Like to Jeff's point about sleeping well that night. Not only just that night, but for like the next 2 years. We're going to see in next chapter that he's going to be held under the governor Felix for 2 years before they're even going to get to a trial. So him not knowing that it's just tonight sleeping good, but for the next 2 years that there's going to be a delay, he can sleep at peace because he knows that God said he's going to get to Rome. So that's going to take like 2 years to get there. So he can rest assured that God's got his back and is protecting him until at least that time. And we know also, flip back to chapter 19. And look at verse 21. Paul says here at Ephesus, now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia. Remember, that's Macedonia would be Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, that whole area. Achaia is Greece, so Corinth and Athens. He said, after that to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, been where? Jerusalem, I must also see Rome. See that? So Paul had a desire to go to Rome, and actually, the book of Romans that we're studying, like I said, again in Sunday school, it starts out, I'm going to read a couple verses here, Romans 1, verse 9. Paul, remember in Romans, he had not been there. He wrote this letter from Corinth to the church at Rome that he heard about, remember? So he didn't plant Rome, the church at Rome. They're just there and he's heard about them, and so he sends a letter back to them and says this in verse 9, for God is my witness, whom I serve with the spirit of the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers, asking that somehow by God's will I may know at last succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, he says in verse 11, and on and on and on. So we know that Paul has his own desire to go to Rome because of the church he's heard there, and he wants to go and what? Check on them and nourish them. And that's why you look at that Romans, I mean, we've been in it for a few months now, it's just huge on theological foundational principles and doctrine. I mean, that's all it is. And so it's a very conducive teaching on, here's the nuts and bolts of salvation, and here's the foundation of the faith in Christ. And that's the book of Romans, and that's the letter he wrote to that church he heard about and wants to go see, so that he didn't plant that church. So he wants to go and see them and make sure they're grounded in the right things. Okay, so he wants to go there, and now he is assured by the Lord that he's going there. Okay, you just think about it back and through his journey. He didn't understand and know really what he was asking for, because we know the method that God uses to get him to Rome is by being on trial for his life and going to go down there, and he's going to be chained to guards that he's going to be preaching to. He's going to get to preach all the way to Caesar himself. Okay, so God uses Paul to go and preach the gospel all the way to the ruler of the known free world. Okay, but Paul didn't know that it was going to be in chains, right? But that's God's sovereign rule. Again, yes, sir.
And, am I right by thinking that like back then, like Caesar, didn't they look at themselves as gods?
Sure, certainly.
Right.
A lot of them.
So they're threatened by this person.
And in a lot of those other areas, a lot of the other cultures, like Egypt obviously was the bigger one. Pharaoh, was worshipped as a god, but they also worshipped all these other gods. Remember Athens, the unknown god, and just so many gods. They just want to cover all their bases. So, yeah, good.
And one other question. So I know that you've spoken about how he was like on house arrest at first.
Okay.
Or was that prior to this?
No, that's a great question, because we're going to address it more as we go forward, but this is good. It's here now, we'll take it now. The timeline we want to understand, I just told you about, in next chapter there's going to be a 2-year gap, a 2-year wait. They're going to now take him, when we read through now the end of this chapter, they're going to take him out of there to protect him. They're going to take him to Caesarea to go before the governor. The governor there at that time's name is Felix, and he doesn't want any part of judging Paul is essentially what's going to happen. And he's going to be out of office in 2 years, so he leaves Paul sitting for 2 years in jail, which is, he has freedoms.
Right.
So it is kind of a quote-unquote house arrest situation, but it's not even really yet, because I don't want to also confuse you with, it's not the 2-year house imprisonment that we refer to as Paul's first imprisonment. So the funny thing is, we refer to Paul as having 2 Roman imprisonments. This 2 years right now that we're talking about isn't even one of those. So he's put in prison for 2 years later in his own home that he rents, and he's allowed to have freedom of people coming, but he can't go anywhere while he is waiting to be tried by Caesar. But this is a 2-year period, even before that. So he's going to appeal to Caesar, but it's going to take him now to get to Rome to Caesar over 2 years, just to get there, because this Felix guy is just going to sit there and doesn't want to do it. And so he waits for the next governor. Festus is going to be the next governor, and he's going to be the one who's going to hear him, and then the appeal will go to Caesar. So, yeah, this little 2-year period we're talking about isn't even referred to as the first imprisonment. So this is kind of like a detainment. This is like a holding cell for the next 2 years before he's even going to be in prison. Okay,
But
so
Festus
good point. So I want everybody to understand that. This is before the first imprisonment. It's a detainment for at least 2 years. Then he will be house imprisoned for 2 years, then released for about 4 years, and then put in a real dungeon prison after that and killed during that imprisonment.
Yeah, 4 years.
It's funny because there's a theme there, all the way back to Jesus, where tons of Roman leaders, it's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what decision they make,
Yeah.
it's like they're going to get caught one way or another. You know what I mean? They don't want to deal with it.
Well, we'll talk about that
Keep
later.
lining it off to
We'll talk about that later. Kind of like these guys, good
They
guys,
won't
bad
let him
guys.
go either.
Felix is
These
like
guys are
a
stalling.
scoundrel and a no good governor, but Festus is a more noble one, and we'll talk about that next coming weeks. But let's get back to our narrative here. So it says, that day, more than 40 Jews made a vow against Paul, and so they vow to not eat or drink until they have killed him. And so they make this plot, and not good to make vows like this, as we'll talk about later, because it's not going to come to fruition,
guys
which
started
means
again.
every one of them are going to break that vow that they vowed to God, which the Old Testament clearly talks about, don't do that. Better to not vow to God than to break that vow. So unless they killed themselves and starved to death, which probably none of them did, they broke the vow. So they do this thing. They set themselves up for failure there, not knowing that Paul is working for God, like Gamaliel said, and they didn't want to listen to him now, I guess. But they tell the chief priests and the elders, and now they're all in on it, right? So they go and tell, hey, here's our plan. We'll get him for you, because we've all made this vow that we're sick of this guy, and we're going to take him out. Here's what we need you guys to do. You need to tell Lysias, the commander, that you want to question him again and to bring him back, because now you have more things you want to ask him about. And before he even gets here, we're going to get him. And so just guys, we can't miss God's hand in all of this, and how he's protecting Paul, and how he's orchestrating everything. Because look at verse 16. Now the son of Paul's sister. So now his own nephew hears just happens, right, it's coincidence. He just happened to be there and overhear the plot to kill Paul, and it's his uncle, and so he's going to go and tell him. And so now Paul, we know, with the commander, has some leeway and has a decent relationship, which is going to flourish even more with some of these Roman soldiers and guards. But, they've got a little rapport going there, and so he allows Paul's nephew to come and tell him. Not only that, he allows Paul to tell one of the centurions, one of the soldiers, to say, hey, go tell the commander to listen to this kid. And he allows it. See what I mean? So recognize that, all right? That he could have easily been like, get out of here, kid. Like, this guy's my prisoner. I'm in charge here. You know what I mean? I tell centurions what to do. I'm not listening to a prisoner and his nephew. Okay, so in that, hold on one second. In that, we got to see again just God's sovereignty of what he's doing with relationships and how he uses the just and the unjust, like we talked about, believers and non-believers. He can use a Roman commander to accomplish his will anytime he wants to, because he can do whatever he wants to with your will and with your life. Okay? Yes, sir, Sam.
No, I was just thinking. I mean, but he wouldn't want that to happen anyways on his watch, because I mean, if they kill him,
Certainly.
I mean, he's.
But that's what I mean. So God's using all those, though, as the puppet master. I mean, he's orchestrating
For
all
sure.
of that to work it to fruition to exactly what is going to happen, which is what he wants to happen. And that's what we got to recognize.
But what he's doing all the time is keeping, because what Paul's actually doing is just sowing seeds. And he's keeping him sowing right to the end.
Amen.
And it's like, that's kind of what we will want to reap. But we
Amen.
don't get to reap.
That's right.
The best we can possibly do is sow, right? The best I could ever
Good.
do is sow, and that's it.
I know we're getting there too, but like I was a little confused. Like I thought they sound like they got extra soldiers.
Yep. So
Okay, but
don't steal my thunder.
like it just kind of fizzled out. Like it didn't really say what happened.
Let's go there now, because that's exactly right. Not only does his nephew over here, but now it appears obviously a boy or a lad, or take this young man. We don't know. It'd be speculation on how old the boy is, but I know in Genesis when it referred to lad, Ishmael was about 14. That's the only thing that pops in my brain right now. But he's young enough that it says that he took him by the hand. It says he grabbed him by the hand and took him aside. So that wasn't viewed awkwardly for him to grab this man's hand. He had to be young. It had to be a young boy, a young lad. And so the young boy tells him, or this boy tells him of the plan of what happened, what's bound to happen. And so he's got a plan for it, and he says, make sure you don't tell anybody what you told me, so don't let this get out. And now getting to it. He commands 2 centurions. Remember, what's a centurion?
Leader of the Roman 100 men.
Good. Yeah, good. A leader of at least 100. So it's like a battalion. This guy's like a battalion commander, right? Is what we're talking about, the Lysias guy. And then he's got under him these guys who are centurions, and they're in charge of at least 100 soldiers, of at least 100 men. So he says, verse 23, he called 2 centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers. There you go. You 2 guys bring your 100 soldiers and 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen, and provide mounts or horses for Paul to ride to get him to Felix, and go in the middle of the night so there's no ruckus and no one knows his plan, and we're going to do it in safety. So not only does God protect him, but he uses the Roman official that saved his life from the beating at the hands of the Jews when they were going to stone him. The soldiers carrying up the stairs, and this Lysias guy has been chosen for God's purpose that he doesn't even understand. He thinks he's doing it for his purpose, but he is now ordering 470 trained armed Roman soldiers and horses and a ride for Paul to journey on to take him off to Caesarea, where he can go to the governor and be protected from this whole thing. Now Paul's sleeping even better at night, right? Now he's taking naps in the daytime, which I highly doubt, but you know what I'm saying. So he does all of this because why? Because God promised to get him to Rome, period. And so he's going to do what he wants to do to make that happen. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes. We'll see. We're going to make it. So he now sends, as they would often do. He's going to stay in his area where he's stationed. And now Claudius Lysias, there's verse 26 where we get the name of this commander. We've been calling him the commander, for the last 2 chapters, and there's our name. He now sends a letter to Felix, to the governor, and sends the 470 men off with the letter and with Paul. And it says, and I think there's some interesting stuff in here. So it says, this man, being Paul, this man was about to be killed by the Jews, and I came with soldiers and rescued him, which is true. When, it says, I learned that he was a Roman citizen.
Right, but not true.
Well, go with that thought. That's where I was getting to. Because he did find out he's a Roman citizen. But he left out to the governor how he found out he was a Roman citizen, because he had wrongly put him in chains twice and was about to flog the dude to find out the details that he needed to know. And that's when I found out he's a Roman soldier. But we're going to leave all that out of there. I saved his life because I knew he was Roman.
Yeah.
You see the little
From the
spin on
beginning,
it. So, and none of us would have done differently. So we'll just leave it at that. We'll just leave it there. But I just found it interesting, like you did, Sky, that when I was reading through it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's not when you found out he was a Roman. So he wanted to know the charge. He brought them before the council. That was chapter 22. And remember, he says, and this is true, he's being charged with questions and thoughts and different belief system about the law by which the Jews are under. And Romans don't care about that. You know, so he's saying, look, none of these charges were worthy of death, not even imprisonment. Like, it's just things like the Pharisees and the Sadducees arguing over what they're arguing. Am I going to go kill them and arrest them? No, like, that's their Jewish thing, dude. Like, let them go have their little things and deal with their own law and decide amongst themselves. And you judge for your own selves about those things, okay? But I noted this too. These things are getting documented here because, why? Because the Holy Spirit wanted to, because God wanted this to be documented for us. But Luke is documenting all the things here for the long haul because the Roman officials are being documented by showing that they find nothing wrong with Paul. Just like Pilate did with Jesus, which didn't stop the outcome or change it. But because there is this thought and belief, which is probably pretty accurate, most scholars think, that when he gets to finally to Caesar later on, that Caesar has the account of essentially the book of Acts, of the account of what's happened with Paul and on this journey, and he gets the whole backstory. And that's a thought because this letter, I know it's been 8 months ago or whatever, but Acts was written like in the early 60s AD, like 60, 61 AD, which is shown to be true in the fact that it leaves off in Acts. Why does Acts end in chapter 28 with Paul going to be in house arrest for 2 years? We know that there's more story after that. So why does Luke stop it there? Because that's where he stopped writing. You follow me? So Luke, this isn't like the gospel accounts where Luke's gospel is written maybe say 30 years, 20, 30 years after Jesus' ascension. This Acts is being like logged like a diary. Luke is on the trip. We did this, we did that. Luke's logging all this. We're like in time with them now. We're not behind time, like looking back. This isn't history even of 30 years. This is current. So when we're reading this right now, this is what Luke's writing is happening right now. You understand me? He's not like in most of the biblical books writing an after fact, like Moses wrote about the Exodus long after that. You know what I mean? And so it's a different thing that Luke is writing an account of this. So when he gets to Rome and the story just abruptly ends there, that's because that's where Luke stopped writing the book of Acts, because that's where God had him stop writing it. Right, that was the end of it. And so we don't find out, we found out through other history accounts about Paul's second imprisonment and his death and all those things. That's not in the book of Acts. Why? Because he stopped writing it at that point. Understand? So that kind of gives a different perspective on this book. So this is a record that, in fact, like I said, is available to Caesar later when he gets there. Luke has this whole thing documented like, hey, here's what all your Roman guys say. Here's what all them say about him. They all found nothing wrong with Paul, and I've documented all of it.
And he
Okay?
brings that to him. He brings that to Caesar.
That's what a major thought process is yes, it's how did Caesar know a lot of this stuff? And there could have been other history writings, and the Romans obviously probably documented their own findings and stuff, but certainly this was documented at the same time. So, yep. So it's speculation that he could have, that essentially Caesar could have read the book of Acts at that time.
Just one more nugget that
Just
just
one more-
makes it all
one more
that
cool-
much more
Right.
believable and
One more cool possibility
I mean,
that
it's
to just
strengthen your faith
you know.
that it's true
Good.
historical.
Yeah, that's right, because Paul still, look, he's still going to go. This is just the first marking we're seeing. Next chapter, he's going to go before Felix, one governor. He's going to go before Festus after that, which is another governor. He's going to go before King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, which is a king at that of one of the Herods at that same time. So he's going to go before all three of them, and then Caesar. So we've got like 4 big-wig guys that he's still going to go before. And every one of them is going to find him innocent, including Caesar, which is why after that first house arrest, that's why he's in house arrest, because they haven't proven anything. They're just holding him. But he's released. because Caesar releases him. He's found innocent. He lets him go. Okay, and so and that changes down the road, and we'll get to why and when and all that stuff later. But that's the point: is that we see, these guys continue to say he did nothing wrong. Okay, so now, yes, sir.
When that ultimately
Last
changes
one.
down the
No, I'm just
road,
kidding.
which I know we weren't going to get to it, but when it ultimately changes, Caesar's still in office.
I'm sorry.
Caesar's still
When
still
he gets
there,
there.
when the ultimate, when he finds
he gets there.
his end.
Yeah, and it's only going to be.
It's at Caesar's hand.
Yeah, it's only going to be a little over like 2 years from where we're at now that he's going to be there. So yeah, Caesar's still same Caesar will still be there. Yes, if that was the question.
Well, I'm saying he goes to 2 years house arrest, 2 years house arrest, released for 4 years, and
Okay.
then imprisoned at the end and killed.
Yes.
By
And, and is it
Caesar.
the same Caesar?
But he's released,
It's Nero, and it will be
Okay.
the same.
so it's different Caesar.
No,
different guy.
same. It'll be the same guy.
Same guy kills him.
Yep.
That let him go earlier.
Yep.
Got it.
That's huge. We're going to talk about that in church history, but we're going to talk about it again here next couple weeks. That's a huge point. That yes, the same guy, Nero, releases him the first time, and imprisons him and kills him 4 years later. Okay, big, huge shift that happens in there that we don't have time to unpack right now. We'll talk about later. Cliffhanger. So let's get back to the letter. When I heard of a plot against him. So now he's reporting, still giving the letter. When I heard of a plot against Paul, I sent him to you, ordering his accusers to come before you to state their case. Obviously, that will be the norm, obviously, for both parties to come before them. So it says the soldiers took Paul and the letter by night to Antipatris. And now this is a town, I didn't even look on our map to see if it's there. But this is a town in between. It's about 30 miles from Jerusalem on the way to Caesarea. Remember, they're now taking him from Jerusalem to Caesarea. And this is a town that Herod the Great built and named after his father, Antipater. So Herod the Great, remember, and these are the Herods I just talked about, one of them. Herod Agrippa II, actually, is who Paul's going to be heard before in the next couple chapters. His great-grandfather. So Herod the Great, the first Herod in the lines, was the one who, in Matthew, was trying to kill all the babies when Jesus was born. All the young boys, 2 years and younger, that was Herod the Great. So this was a city that he built and named it after his pagan, horrible father. And so that's the town that they're going to that night, and that's where they go and stop. Because look, it looks like they make a camp and a stop off. They don't make it all the way from Jerusalem to Caesarea. They stop in the middle at this Antipatris, and it said, because it says what, the next day, right? It says on the next day in verse 32. So the next day the soldiers returned to the barracks, but it says the horsemen went on to Caesarea. So there were how many? There was 400 soldiers. So they all returned, and there were 70 horsemen. So he's still, the next day, even being cautious and protecting him by taking him the next day into Caesarea with 70 armed guards to protect him. So they deliver Paul and the letter to Felix, and I put a little note there that, look, the plot of the 40 assassins failed, right? They have seen their vow failing now, and so a couple days later they realize Paul's gone. There's nothing they can even do about it. So it's failed. They're done. Felix asks him now. I want to close this quickly so we can get back to that question and others if there are. Felix asks him what province he's from, and the governor hears he's from Cilicia, because remember, he's from Tarsus, which is in Cilicia. And he said, okay, I'll give you a hearing when your accusers get here. So he needs both parties to be there. And he commanded Paul to be guarded at Herod's praetorium. So there's Herods again. And look, remember, the Herods were a line of kings that were not in the line of the Judean kings and the Israel kings. They were kings that were actually appointed by the Romans. Okay, the Romans, when they took over, had the Jewish kings, kind of as their footstools. They would put them kind of like their own Roman governors, like Pontius Pilate, but would be over an area. But they would also have a king, a Herod, that would be kind of a go-between between the Romans and the Jews. You understand? So if they have a Jewish leader, we need that still. But the Roman leader obviously has the authority. But still the Jewish leader has some authority, right? He's still the king of the Jews. but he's under a tight thumb of the Roman authorities. So this king is there, and so Herod's palace or praetorium is there, and it would have been, a palace, a king's palace, but it would have been, it would have had prison underneath. It still would have had cells, like prison cells, in place to hold prisoners. So that's where he is off to be kept guard. Okay. And go.
So the Herod king, they're like historically like they're not really in line with the Pharisees and the Sadducees as much.
No, they're like terrible on their
Never
own
agree.
on their own rights,
Right.
man. I mean, they're awful. I mean, awful.
They don't
So,
follow the law.
Yeah, Herod the Great tried to kill Jesus. Remember, he killed all the 2-year-old boys around that town. Then his son Antipas was the next, and they're all called Herod. But then they have, so it'll say King Herod. You got to go and line up and see which one it is. So Herod the Great was the first one. Then his son Antipas was the one who threw John the Baptist in prison because John the Baptist called him out for marrying his sister, who was his brother's wife, and the whole incestual crazy thing there, and his niece dancing for him and getting them all excited. And so remember all that scene in Matthew? He threw him in prison. He ended up killing him and beheading him. So his son Antipas killed John the Baptist. Then his nephew, who is Herod the Great's grandson, is Herod Agrippa, who is the one back in chapter 12 who kills James and puts Peter in prison, and yet the angel of the Lord comes, remember, lets Peter out. So that's the one who kills James. And now this one we're seeing here now is actually King Herod Agrippa II. So it's the guy who killed James, it's his son, and he's who is going to have Paul on trial here in the next couple chapters. And shockingly and surprisingly, it's going to be different than the other Herods.
Yeah.
A little bit. So
like
again,
family
God
tradition
doing amazing
for-
things.
You
So,
would think that he would hate.
but that's the lineage we're talking about. Not good. Not good. Worse probably than the Pharisees.
You'd think that king would feel the need to follow in his, in their footsteps, go
Yeah,
a
not
Christian, and
not a good heritage.
anti-Jesus.
Yeah,
You know.
out of bed. Tech girl.
Yeah.
Brian, did you have thoughts, man? I didn't want to cut it off. I just wanted to finish our text. I know you guys had a little sidebar
That
going.
was mainly Sam.
Yeah, it's
Just
mainly me.
I know.
It's coming up with awesome
I know, but it's on
ideas.
video, so I'm gonna call you out. So.
It's back in Romans first, second.
I see you got your rank now.
No, was it good though? Was it about? I know it was at the time we were talking about what happened in the church. Is that what it's about?
No, I was just
Okay.
thinking also about, it's just crazy how you think like the Jewish people should be closer to Paul's side. I mean, here you have
Oh.
like the pinnacle of the Gentiles, basically, like the Romans are like kind of like the big Gentile group, and they're just like they're kind of more for them than obviously because they don't have as much invested, I guess. But still, it's like they're just more receptive and just I don't
Gotcha.
know, it just keeps going like that. Like
Gotcha.
Paul just has more
Crazy guy.
luck, I guess, which is probably terrible terminology, but he just has more success with even that side than you. Yeah.
Yeah, and everybody's playing their own side the way they wanted to play it, But we know, again, going back to what you're saying about, all that was God. All the sides of the politics were all shaping up to go exactly the way it was supposed to go. And so is ours, so take hope. So are our politics with our presidents and all the people in the world today. Romans 13 is pretty clear about why that's happening. God puts them in place how he wants to and when he wants to, and that's just how it is. So whether you're happy with it or you're not, it's already been ordained and appointed. And that's just freedom of your right to vote. Sorry to ruin it for you. No, any serious thoughts or comments on closing? Questions?
It's your right to vote and everything, really.
Good,
He's
good.
got the